The fog rolled in thick and heavy that evening, shrouding the entire village in an impenetrable veil. Elena trudged along the cobblestone streets, her breath visible in the frigid air. The small village of Ravens Hollow was steeped in mystery, a place where whispers carried further than the wind, and shadows seemed to have lives of their own. It was the kind of town that visitors passed through quickly, their curiosity stifled by the oppressive atmosphere. Elena had grown up in Ravens Hollow, but had left for university, vowing never to return. Life had other plans. Her mother had passed away 2 months ago, and Elena was back to settle the affairs of the old house, a sprawling, decrepit manor that sat on the outskirts of the village. The townsfolk referred to it as Gravewood House, a name that carried with it centuries of ghost stories and eerie folklore. But Elena was not one to believe in such things. That evening, as she locked the doors of the village shop and prepared to head back to the manor, a strange sound broke through the stillness, a low, guttural growl. She froze, her pulse quickening. The street was empty, the fog so dense she could barely see 5 feet ahead. Probably just a stray dog, she muttered, her voice wavering. But the sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't a growl, it was a voice, deep and raspy, speaking words she couldn't understand. Elena! Her heart leapt into her throat. She spun around, but there was nothing but mist and darkness. Clutching her bag tightly, she quickened her pace. The air grew colder with every step, the kind of cold that seeped into her bones and made her teeth chatter. Her mother's warnings echoed in her mind, warnings she had dismissed as the ramblings of a superstitious old woman. Never walk alone at night in Ravens Hollow, her mother had said. There are things in the dark that were never meant to be seen. By the time she reached Gravewood House, her nerves were frayed. She slammed the heavy wooden door shut and locked it, exhaling deeply. The house was eerily silent, its ancient walls groaning as if settling into the night. She turned on the lights, but they barely illuminated the cavernous rooms. Shadows pooled in every corner, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and mildew. Elena decided to make herself tea, hoping it would calm her nerves. As she boiled the water, she heard it again, the voice. This time, it was inside the house. "Elena!" The cup slipped from her hands, shattering on the floor. Her breathing quickened as she grabbed a kitchen knife, her only weapon against whatever had invaded her home. She crept through the dark hallways, her footsteps echoing. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a scream in the silence. She reached the living room and froze. In the dim light of the flickering chandelier, she saw a figure standing by the fireplace. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its head nearly grazed the ceiling. Its face was obscured by a veil of shadows, but she could feel its gaze piercing her. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. It tilted its head, mimicking the motion of a curious animal. Then it took a step forward. Elena stumbled back, her grip on the knife tightening. The figure's movements were wrong, jagged and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. "Stay back!" she screamed, brandishing the knife. But the figure didn't stop. It raised an arm, its long, spindly fingers pointing directly at her. The air grew colder, and Elena's breath came out in ragged gasps. Just as the figure was about to reach her, a deafening knock echoed through the house. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the walls. The sound reverberated through the manor, growing louder and more insistent. The figure stopped and turned its head toward the source of the noise, as if distracted. Taking advantage of the moment, Elena bolted. She ran upstairs to her old bedroom and locked the door behind her. Her heart pounded as she pressed her back against the door, the knife still clutched in her trembling hands. The knocking continued, but now it was accompanied by whispers. Hundreds of voices speaking in unison, their words unintelligible, but filled with malice. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. Elena strained to hear any sound, her ears ringing from the abrupt stillness. Then, from the corner of her room, she heard it, the faint sound of breathing. She turned her head slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. In the corner, where the shadows were darkest, 2 glowing eyes stared back at her. They were not human. They were too large, too bright, and filled with an unnatural hunger. "Why are you here?" Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face. The creature didn't answer. It stepped forward, and she could see it more clearly now. Its skin was pale and stretched taut over its skeletal frame. Its mouth filled with jagged teeth, twisted into a grotesque smile. Elena screamed and lunged at the creature with the knife, but it moved with inhuman speed, dodging her attack effortlessly. It grabbed her wrist, its grip cold and unyielding, and leaned in close. She could feel its breath on her face, rancid and suffocating. "You should have stayed away," it hissed. Before she could react, everything went black. Elena woke up in her bed, the morning sunlight streaming through the curtains. For a moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare. But when she looked down at her wrist, she saw the bruises. Dark, finger-shaped marks that confirmed it had been real. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from an unknown number. "You can't escape us." Panicking, she looked out the window. The fog had lifted, but the village seemed different, as if it were holding its breath. She knew she couldn't stay in Ravenshollow any longer. She packed her belongings hastily and drove away, leaving Gravewood House and its horrors behind. But the nightmares followed her. Every night, she dreamed of the creature and its glowing eyes, and every morning she woke up to new bruises and scratches on her body. She tried to start a new life in a different city, but the whispers continued. They were in her apartment, her car, even in her own mind. One evening, as she sat in her living room, the lights flickered, and the temperature dropped. She felt the familiar chill of the creature's presence. Turning slowly, she saw it standing in the corner, its glowing eyes fixed on her. It stepped closer this time, each movement agonizingly slow, deliberate. A faint scratching sound accompanied its steps, as though claws dragged across the wooden floor. Elena backed up into the wall, trapped. Her screams echoed in the empty room as it raised a single bony finger to its lips, silencing her without a word. "You belong to us now," it said, its voice echoing with the weight of countless others. Its whispers seemed to crawl under her skin, each syllable laced with malice. Elena clawed at the wall behind her, searching for anything, any way to fight back. Suddenly, the lights surged, glowing bright, before plunging the room into pitch darkness. Her breathing quickened, and the only sound was her own frantic heartbeat. When the lights returned, she found herself no longer in her apartment, but back in Gravewood House. The manor's decayed walls loomed around her, and the oppressive air was suffocating. She spun around, disoriented, until she realized she wasn't alone. Shadows flickered on the walls, forming shapes that twisted and writhed as if alive. The glowing eyes were everywhere, watching her, mocking her. "Elena," the voices hissed in unison, "you'll never leave." Tears streamed down her face as the floor beneath her began to tremble. The walls stretched and groaned, their surfaces warping into grotesque faces that sneered at her despair. She fell to her knees, clutching her head, the voices overwhelming her. The last thing she saw before the world went dark again was the creature's jagged smile, closer than ever. Days, months, years, time lost all meaning for Elena as she wandered the endless halls of Gravewood House. The door she opened led to another nightmare. Rooms filled with mirrors that reflected her fears, hallways that stretched endlessly, and staircases that spiraled into nothingness. The creature followed her, always just out of reach, its whispers the only constant in her torment. Her sanity frayed, her strength waned, but one thing was clear: Gravewood House was alive, and it would never let her go.